Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here, and this should be a really interesting panel on the Sunni-Shia sectarian war across what remains, anyway, of the Sykes-Picot line. We have a great panel here today. I'd like to introduce the panelists. Then I'll kick off the discussion. We'll each speak for a few minutes with the goal of saying enough really interesting and enough really controversial things so that there's no excuse for not having plenty of questions and save as much time as possible for that interaction with everyone here in the room. I'm Dr. Matthew Levitt. I direct the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department, and before that FBI Counterterrorism. I'm the author of the book on Hezbollah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. And we'll sign as many copies of the book as you care to buy at the Georgetown University press table right outside. Thank you very much. We also have my friend and colleague to my left, your right, Jeff White. Jeff is a defense fellow at the Washington Institute, specializing in military and security areas of the Levant and Iran. Before joining the Washington Institute, Jeff worked for 34 years at the DIA on all things defense, military, and Middle East. To my right, to your left, we have Dr. Michael Knights, who is the Leifer Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, specializing in military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and the Gulf states. Mike travels to Iraq regularly and has written and spoken prolifically on the subject, drawing from his regular research there on the ground. And finally, last but certainly not least, to my far right, your left, my good friend Phillip Smyth. Phillip is a researcher at the University of Maryland. He writes the blog Hezbollah Cavalcade, focusing on Shia Islamist groups in the Middle East. He has recently completed the definitive study on Shia militias in the region, which I'm very proud that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy will soon be publishing, and has become at a very young age, despite his beard, really the go-to person in Washington if you want to know the most granular details about which Shia militia is doing what and what their relations are to everyone else, which is something that changes on a nearly daily basis. And so I'm thrilled that my three friends and colleagues were able to join me here today. Allow me to kick it off briefly, then we'll go to Jeff on things going on in the war in Syria, to Mike on how the sectarianism is affecting the battle in Iraq, and to Phillip on the Shia groups in general. I take no pleasure in saying that when we get together here at the next ASMEA conference in a few years, the one theme I can guarantee you that we will be talking about, whether or not Iraq remains a unified country geographically, Syria, whether there is a Kurdistan, whether the Sykes-Picot line actually continues to exist or not, all of those I'm sure will be issues for future panels and lots of discussion. But the only one with staying power 10, 20 years from now will be the issue of sectarianism in the region, which has always been an issue, but never like today. The defining break, the defining crack in the region today is the sectarian divide, which is something that will not soon be forgotten, not by the Sunnis especially, but not only in Syria, who will not soon forget what the Alawite regime, the Assad regime in Syria, and Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Iraqi and other Shia militants, and of course Iran have done and are doing to them today in Syria, and not what the Shia equally believe they are facing from no less an existential threat from Sunni groups, in particular ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahl al-Sham, etc. But the way that the Khorasan group, or the Wolf Unit as they call themselves, Khorasan group was actually our name for them, this piece of Jabhat al-Nusra near Aleppo, which is focusing not on Assad, but on carrying out attacks in the West. And the way ISIS is now beginning also to inspire and maybe even carry out, if you've read today's news on these individuals arrested in Switzerland, plots of their own in the West, that's a strict counterterrorism issue, an issue I'll leave for another panel. That will come and go in waves as it always does. But the sectarian divide between these groups and the way they are shaping the remaining nation states is absolutely critical to understand. And you and I will both have to excuse people for whom this is just too complicated. And so it will lead to very informed people, highly intelligent journalists writing for outlets like, say, the New York Times, arguing that maybe the United States and Iran are actually in de facto alliance. And it's understandable how there's this misunderstanding. When it comes to the sectarian divide, which side are we on? The administration clearly, wisely wants to be seen as not being on one side or the other, not being alongside the Shia against the Sunnis or the Sunnis against the Shia, but it makes for complicated bedfellows. So in Syria, we're against the Assad regime and therefore by default against Lebanese Hezbollah and the Shia militias in Iran, and by the way, Russia. But on the other side of the border, in Iraq, we are siding with the Shia government against the Sunnis. We have today, by default, certainly not by design, but we, the United States and the West, we have a Sunni problem. And the problem is this: we are going to have a very, very hard time convincing our Sunni allies, our Sunni moderate allies, to do things with us, that we will have the staying power on these issues in this region, which we don't have a great record for, especially coming against the backdrop of, again, by default, what has appeared to be a complete lack of interest in what is happening to Sunnis in the region. So without in the least bit minimizing the horror of the brutal assassinations of Western journalists and aid workers over the same period of time in which these individuals were captured, how many tens, at a minimum, tens of thousands of Sunnis have been killed, not only by the Shia side, but by the most extreme Sunni side, ISIS, as well. And you heard from the West very little or nothing. You certainly saw from the West, in terms of action, very little or nothing. But now that there have been these beheadings, now you see significant, some on this panel, including myself, might argue still insufficient, but significant military action. In other words, there's the sense that it was only Sunnis, and therefore we didn't act. And that when we did act in the first instance, it was when there were minorities, non-Sunni minorities, who were at risk. And then you had the president say that his original intent was not to get involved in a war, but rather to provide humanitarian support where possible, to defend U.S. diplomats in Erbil, in Baghdad, even as all these things were happening to Sunnis around the world. And so we have, and not just the United States, we in the West have a sectarian problem where it's unclear who we are for and who we are against. And that shouldn't be the case, because the position, of course, that we're trying to negotiate, that we're trying to navigate, is that we are for moderation and we are against extremism. Let's not confuse that with secular and religious. You can be religious and still not be extremist. We're just not articulating that particularly well. So it's not clear to people that we are against extremism, whether you are Sunni or Shia, in part because many don't see the world that way, including some of our moderate Sunni allies, some of whom have been willing to fund quite extreme Sunni groups, not necessarily because they're so extreme, but because they've been the only or the most effective in battling their sectarian adversaries on the other side and defending Sunni communities. So this has become, over a period of time, a much, much more complicated set of problems than it had been at the outset. You really have to sit back for a minute and remember that what happened in Syria was not sectarian when it first started in the least bit. This was actually an Arab Spring type of uprising when the Assad regime arrested a group of teenagers who had sprayed graffiti in the south, in Dura, and had done what they usually do, which is arrest them and beat them up pretty badly and send them home to their families, saying you might not want to do that in the future. But against the context of the Arab Spring, that didn't sit so well anymore. And so protests became rallies, became rebellion, became civil war, but then very, very quickly became a sectarian conflict. And the reason it did is because the Alawite regime, and again, you have to really step back to remember that neither the Sunnis nor the Shia traditionally see the Alawites as full Muslims, even the Shia. But Syria is a critical ally to Iran and, of course, to Hezbollah, and they both jumped in, full-hearted, all in defense of the Assad regime, together with Russia, at a time and continuing to today when there was no commensurate support for moderates by the international community. And that really started this sectarian drive, which then very quickly has bled across the border, in part because of opportunity. ISIS saw a vacuum in Syria, which was its blessing, which led to its rebirth, and then opportunity in Iraq that was never fully intentioned. They went to free people from jail in Mosul and saw that the Iraqi army completely fell apart in the face of this Sunni militant group and grabbed an opportunity that was presented to them. Whatever happens in the next 12, 18, 24 months, 5, 10 years in terms of the geopolitical reality on the ground, whatever happens in terms of the pure counterterrorism efforts to deal with groups that are engaging in acts of brutality at home and terrorism abroad, the single theme that we will continue to deal with, and it will not stop at Syria and Iraq. Watch Bahrain, watch Yemen, watch North Africa, will be sectarianism. Let me stop there, and let me invite my colleagues to jump in much more detail, and then we will open it up to conversation. Jeff, the mic is yours.
Okay, can you all hear me? All right, very good. I'm going to talk about ISIS from a military perspective, and I'm going to focus on ISIS as it operates in Syria. So to start out with, to get to sort of a basic factor here is how many do we think ISIS has in Syria in the way of forces? Well, nobody knows for sure, but maybe it's something like 10 to 15,000 combatants operating inside Syria. Roughly half of all of ISIS forces, at least what the U.S. intelligence community thinks they have. There's been a figure that came out recently that suggests ISIS might have 15 to 25,000 in Syria, which would be a significant jump, but the U.S. intelligence community, I think, is sticking with the lower figure. They don't have a conventional order of battle. They operate in ad hoc groups. They put together force packages sized to basically the problem, the kind of battle they're going to be involved in fighting. These can range from a few hundred troops to several or many hundreds of troops, some thousands. So they have a very flexible kind of operational structure. They're equipped, pretty heavily. They have a wide range of heavy weapons, tanks, artillery, mortars, anti-aircraft guns. Most of these they've acquired by capture, especially from the Iraqi army, but also from the Syrian army. In effect, the Iraqi army and the Syrian army are their supply depot. The captures of weapons from these organizations fuel the ability of ISIS to advance, to carry out its operations. I think ISIS is growing in everyone's mind to some very formidable, very dangerous, very capable opponent. And it is, I think, that in some ways. It has a lot of strengths. It has unity of command. There's a strong leadership cadre that directs operations. Even if operations are flexible at the local level, there still is a central command that conducts the kinds of activities it wants to, and the forces basically follow that. It has a strategic and operational sense, and I mean by that it, in a military sense, it knows what it's doing. It knows how to maneuver its forces. It knows what's important. It knows when to fight, when to retreat, and so on. It's highly mobile. This is something that's given it a great advantage in the fighting. It can move forces over long distances and concentrate forces, rapidly. This is based on the large numbers of vehicles, four-wheel drive and so on, vehicles they've captured. It's an experienced force. The leadership's been involved in war for a long time. The ISIS forces understand the kind of war they're involved in, and they're pretty good at it. ISIS has, what's called interior lines, right? That means they can shift forces back and forth between Syria and Iraq, quite readily, and they do. And they can shift forces within a given theater, either the Syrian theater or the Iraqi theater, quite readily. They have a recruitment base. They have the foreigners, that are, as we read today in the Washington Post, that are still flocking into Syria. Not all of them going to ISIS. But a number of them going in that direction. But they also have a local recruiting base from the Sunni population that they can draw on. They don't appear to have any shortage of fighters. They're cohesive, right? They fight together. They act together. They fight hard, even under the pressure of combat. A lot of this is based on, on the religious component of the ISIS organization and so on. But in military terms, we'd say it's a cohesive combat force, right? And they're resilient. They take a beating and keep on fighting. Right? They don't collapse in the pressure on the battlefield and so on. And they come back. If they do suffer reverse, they come back. And I think these qualities of cohesion and resilience are being demonstrated now in the Battle of Kobani, right? Where they've been fighting for like 40, I think we're at 44 days now in the Kobani battles. And ISIS is taking a pounding from U.S. air power and so on. Had a lot of casualties, but they keep fighting, they keep coming, and so on. Nevertheless, they also have weaknesses. ISIS is, we should make them 10 feet tall. We should make them 6 feet taller or something, right? They're not, unconquerable. They're not the Golden Horde. Right? One of their weaknesses, I think, is the force to space ratio, right? The caliphate is a huge area, relative to the size of the forces that they have. It's just a lot of space, for ISIS to have to control. And they also have what I would say is a force to task ratio problem, right? That is, they've got a certain number of forces, but they have many tasks, many operational areas that they're active in, many things that those forces have to do. So those represent, potential weaknesses for them. They have uncertain allies. In the process of expanding the caliphate, they have pulled in by one means or another tribal elements, Baathist elements, other kinds of people's groups and so on. And these people are not as dedicated, probably not as determined, not as resilient, not as cohesive, whatever you want to say. So there's an element of forces that ISIS uses and exploits that isn't as cohesive and as solid as their main force. The firepower, the weapons that I've talked about are also distributed. They're not concentrated, right? The weapons they've captured in the fighting against the Iraqi military and against inside Syria are spread across their forces. So it's hard for ISIS to put together a big package of heavy firepower. And we see the effects of that in some of the battles they're involved in. They don't have hundreds of tanks operating or hundreds of pieces of artillery operating on one front or in one operation. They have a few or some. And they lack large formations, right? Large, well-organized formations. They can put together, as I said, these ad hoc groupings, for combat and for operations. But the lack of larger formations that have what we would call combined arms formations and so on, I think prevents them or hinders their ability to conduct decisive operations and actions. So it's, on the one hand, their organization gives them some strengths, but on the other hand, it gives them some weaknesses. But it's also fair to say, I think, that that ISIS it pursues a military strategy in Syria, and I think in Iraq as well. It doesn't act randomly or just opportunistically or so on. It actually it's thought about what it needs to do in a military sense in Syria, and goes out to achieve that on the battlefield. They have goals, they have means, and they put those together in what we would call a strategy. I think the first goal of ISIS, military goal of ISIS in Syria, is consolidation of the heartland, right? That is, they work systematically to eliminate pockets of resistance, areas that are controlled by forces that are opposed to them, to wipe these out and to prevent any organizations from operating inside their heartland. We see them do this basically consistently or all the time. The second goal is expansion of the heartland. They are constantly pushing to expand their area of control. Right now, today and yesterday, we saw them make a major move in Homs province, in eastern Homs province. They have either taken or are pressing on a major Syrian government airfield at Tias. They've taken or retaken the gas fields in the Palmyra area. So they have ISIS is kind of like a balloon or like water, right? It expands into space all the time. A third military goal, I think, is to take control of the borders in the areas that and that's the international borders, where they're operating. We see this along the Turkish border and the Iraqi border, eliminating anybody else's control. And then the final military goal, for ISIS is, the classic military goal of destruction or absorption of the enemy's forces. So these are the principal goals, objectives, or whatever of their operations. ISIS's operations, and it's the nature of the organization and so on, has created a legion of enemies. Right? It not only generates forces in its own operations, it generates enemies, and there are a lot of them. Right? The problem, with this, what ISIS is able to exploit here, is that these enemies are not really united. They don't act effectively together. So ISIS is able to concentrate or use its military power against the various enemies that it is awakened, pretty much as it wants. The FSA, let's just call the elements in Syria, armed elements in Syria that aren't ISIS, just call them the FSA, although there's a lot of issues under that, of course. But the FSA has fought ISIS fairly well at some points in the conflict in Syria. Right now, it's more in a defensive posture, but sometimes and in some places, the FSA has been able to push back, fairly effectively on ISIS. There's a whole slew of Islamist organizations, JN being one, but the Islamic Army or Islamic Front, other Islamist elements that have also fought against ISIS and in some cases had some successes. There's the regime, the Syrian regime forces. They have not been very successful against ISIS. Over this period, during the summer months, ISIS defeated major regime forces in Raqqa province in 3 significant battles. ISIS has just defeated some combination of regime forces in eastern Homs province. So the regime has actually had quite a bit of trouble fighting ISIS. We have Kurds, and we have Kobani and so on, and in Hasaka province we have tribal elements that are also engaged, at least occasionally, against ISIS. And now we have the coalition, right? The US-led coalition, which is probably, in Syria anyway, is probably 90 to 95% of the air operations are conducted by the US, as the strike operations. Over half the strike sorties flown by the U.S. in Syria have been against Kobani, or in the Kobani area against ISIS targets. We bombed the Kobani area every day since October 5th. There have been strikes in that area, and we are in the course of that we are inflicting some losses on ISIS. I just wrap up by talking a little bit about the prospects for this organization in Syria. As I've indicated, it's not always successful. It can suffer reverses, it can be stopped, it can be pushed out of areas and so on. But what this requires is organized forces that are well supported and determined, the kind of forces we see like in the Kobani area, but have also been active in other areas. So it isn't a force that cannot be defeated or at least stopped on the battlefield. It's not all conquering, but it is patient. Right? ISIS, it's willing to take some defeats and setbacks and come back. Right? It keeps pushing. It keeps pressing. It's willing to pay a price where it thinks it's important to win. We're seeing this again in the Kobani fighting, that ISIS is willing to stand and fight there to achieve what it thinks is an important goal. It uses suicide tactics, right? But it doesn't conduct suicide operations. It doesn't. If it thinks it's not going to be successful in an area, over time it'll quit fighting there or pull back or shift its effort to another area. And we may be seeing this now in a potential shift from the Kobani region to the Homs region. So they advance where they can. They raid where they can. They try and exploit areas of weakness by the opposition, and score successes, all in the way of trying to achieve their military goals. And with that, I quit.
Excellent, Jeff. Thanks for that state of affairs on ISIS in Syria. Let's move across the border to Iraq, and Mike will talk about sectarianism in Iraq and how that affects the security forces there fighting ISIS. Use that one.
Thank you very much, Matt. And very useful to have Jeff talk there, not just because he's always great to listen to, but also because 95% of what he said is very, very applicable to how ISIS operates in Iraq. The only differences I would make, and we can talk about this more later, is that ISIS is not really expanding in Iraq anymore, at least not into strategically vital areas. It's able to gain ground in marginal areas. It's also able to restlessly shift forces around and hammer away at the tightening circle of forces that are genuinely moving against it across Iraq, mainly along the main river valleys. Like everything in Iraq, all life, everything is based around river valleys. Always has been, always will be, and that's true for the offensive operations as well by the federal government and the militias. In Iraq, ISIS faces more opposition. And that may sound strange in some ways, because all we've heard about for the last 4 or 5 months is the total collapse of the Iraqi security forces. But it was never a total collapse, and new forces have been either generated or regenerated and did get back into the fight. Same's true for the Kurds as well. But we can bring some of that up in Q&A, because that's a subject all of its own. I've spent quite a bit of time embedded with the Iraqi security forces, and I know the Peshmerga well. They also have resilience, and they do also dust themselves off and get back in the fight. So I'm going to very briefly trying to talk about Iraq in a bit of a different way from Jeff. to focus on sectarianism in this conflict. Now, I'm not a Islamic scholar or anything like that, but what I'll reflect is what I've seen from on the ground and from operating with security forces and just in the events of the last 6 months. First of all, in terms of it being a civil war type environment, it's clear that on the surface, ISIL does have the intention to overthrow the state, and many of its allied elements in Iraq believe that the Baghdad government can be overthrown. They still labour under that, what I'd say is a delusion. And it's proven to be a very difficult delusion to shift. I mean, this is one of the reasons why early hopes that we might be able to flip some of the Ba'athist groups over against ISIS proved to be misplaced. Because the lesson they've taken from the last few years, the protest movements, Syria, etc., is that maybe it's possible that you can actually mount a serious revolution, and that some aspect of your former domination of Shia majority Iraq can return. But underneath these illusions, which I think both ISIS and the Ba'ath elements still foster, the real nature of this conflict in Iraq is that what we're looking at is really violent secessionism on sectarian lines, as it happens. And the flip side of that, the potential solution to what we're seeing in Iraq these days, is really strong federalism, probably on ethno-sectarian lines as well. I've been feeling for years that the key conflict brewing and coming was not necessarily so much a sectarian conflict in people's hearts, but a war between centralisers and decentralisers, between those who believed that you could turn the clock back and those who believed that after 2003 Iraq did have to fundamentally change from how it had been, one-man dictatorship. Now, the second thing to say about sectarianism in this conflict is that ethno-sectarian boundaries, identity-based boundaries, have become key to the prosecution of this war. If you draw a map, as I have done many times, of where the front lines are, they look very ethno-sectarian. They, in many places, in most places, conform almost exactly to the boundaries between major sectarian groups. There are a lot of cross-sectarian, multi-ethnic places in Iraq, and those often become the key battlegrounds. But it is true that ISIS has struggled to enter and control Shia and Kurdish areas. And in fact, as Jeff pointed out, talking about the parsimony of ISIS, the fact that it doesn't tend to bang its head on things for too long if it can't break them, they've largely avoided trying to take over entirely Shia areas, large, heavily populated Shia areas. There are a couple of examples. Shia Turkmen areas in Tal Afar and other places that are very cut off geographically from the rest of Shia Iraq particularly. And similarly, the ISF, the Iraqi security forces, and the Peshmerga have been very hesitant to try and fight their way into heavily populated Sunni Arab areas. They've generally failed when they've attempted to do so. Now they're almost explicitly only going into these areas, in most cases, where they can secure tribal cooperation. And we saw that recently at Rabia on the Iraq-Syria border, where the Peshmerga brought with them Shammar Confederation tribal liaison officers, essentially, to go and explain to the local people as the Peshmerga rocked into town, these people are here with the backing of Sheikh Abdullah Yawa, the paramount sheikh. And in some Sunni areas, I'll point out, this tribal cooperation is increasingly forthcoming. All the key confederations in Iraq have contributed to some extent to the federal government's war effort. The Dulaim Confederation in the Western Euphrates River Valley and Anbar have to some extent been on side since day one and are responsible for the fact that Ramadi didn't fall in January when we had the first major ISIS breakthrough. Likewise, the Shammar, as I just said, up in the Rabia border crossing, have made temporary common cause with their Kurdish enemies, and Sheikh Abdullah Yawa is currently based out of Erbil. Much to his displeasure, I'm sure, but he's recognised the need to temporarily work with the Kurds. Likewise, Sheikh Anwar al-Assi, one of the key sheikhs of the Ubaidi clans around Kirkuk, is based out of Sulaymaniyah at the moment, working with the Kurds, the intelligence agencies and the federal government to try and restore his ability to go back and rule his tribes outside Kirkuk. Likewise, parts of the more patchy Jaburi Confederation, Dulia, Hawija, all sorts of different places, Beiji, are in parts, like the Dulaim, starting to come on side. So it's not a clear Sunni versus Shia struggle, but there is this component whereby it's very difficult for one side, one sectarian bloc or ethnic bloc, to decisively break into another bloc's core geographic areas, and they're not really trying that hard to do so. The third out of 4 points I'd make is that let's assume for a second that ISIS will get rolled back and will be turned back into a terrorist organisation or a large insurgent movement, and I believe that's definitely going to be the case. How does this conflict shape Iraq? That's the more important question. Not when do we get rid of ISIS, but what shape do we find Iraq and Syria in at the end of it? And in Iraq it's particularly stark, the impact, because it's not a civil war environment. When this started in June, it was still a recognisable state functioning in a broadly recognisable way. So, you know, what's this going to do to Iraq come out the other side of this? Will the cure be worse than the disease? I'll say three things about what's happening in Iraq right now. First of all, we have disintegrated communities on ethno-sectarian lines, places where Sunni and Shia trust each other even less than they did to begin with, and particularly Kurd and Arab. Will those communities get rebuilt? Will they get reintegrated? Or will they stay in pieces? Around Amerli, we have a primarily Turkoman environment in which the same major tribal groups, the Bayati, include Sunni and Shia, include Turkoman and Arab. And it's very difficult to put this back together after it's shattered. If one were to think of Iraq at the moment, there's the Kurdish part, there's the southern Iraqi part, and there's broken glass everywhere else. How do you put it back together? Maybe you can put it back together, but like a vase that's been thrown on the floor, you can put it back together, but you can see that it was broken. And that's what Iraq's going to be like. It's never going to go back entirely the same way. A second aspect is, will we see a disintegrated security architecture? You know, right now we have a Sunni Minister of Defence, and the US is throwing a lot of weight behind him. We have a Badr Minister of Interior. We have an informal structure whereby Badr is the Shia militia element that was based out of Iran throughout the Iran-Iraq War and fought as part of the Iranian order of battle from the 1980s onwards, that they are running significant elements of the armed forces and that they are running most of the serious offensive operations, at least in cross-sectarian areas, including just south of Baghdad, where they did a rare thing. They went into an entirely Sunni area, very resistant, and they took this area over, in part to protect the lines through which Shia pilgrims will be walking for the next month and a half, a sea of humanity walking right past one of ISIS's strongholds. So the federal government and the militias went in and pushed them back. But we're going to need to rebuild this security sector in the future, and it's going to be a case of two dueling security sector reform programs, us and the Iranians. And that's how it's been now, right the way back to 2003 and even before. And you know, we're going to see the next episode of that now unfolding. But you know, it's always been there within the security forces. I remember when I was embedded with Iraqi security forces at one of the headquarters in Basra, they would use the they always had these Iranian-trained officers called the Damaj, the amalgamation guys, and they would be in the headquarters. They were typically the security officers at the headquarters, so that they could get my passport details and all the other Westerners in the headquarters, and so that they could keep an eye on everybody and what they were doing. But what the Iraqi army officers used to do is they give them, the only uniforms they would give them had Sons of Iraq patches on them, so that when you saw one coming, you knew to wrap up your conversation and exclude that individual. That struggle is now escalating within the Iraqi military. Will the Iraqi military survive? We don't know. How do we get the militia the Shia militia, how do we put that genie back in the box? And could this damage control effort actually be the solution to save Iraq? Could something like the National Guard, which is being very seriously talked about, particularly within the Sunni provinces, be a way of decentralising security decision making? Because if you get to the heart of what Sunnis in Iraq tend to want, it's decentralisation of security decision making, of judicial procedures. It's not being arrested and being ransomed to be released by the local Iraqi army commander. It's not being disappeared. And that could solve a lot of problems if we do successfully decentralise security decision making. The final point I'll make is that one of the most dangerous things that could happen to Iraq in the next few months, and we have a budget coming, it has to be built in the next couple of months, is a disintegrated economy. Because if there's one thing that holds Iraq together as a unit, despite its ethno-sectarian fractures, it's Basra's oil money. Some people are truly in Iraq for the money, millions of them. And if that money stops coming from Baghdad, for many of those people, there is just literally no reason to be in Iraq anymore, particularly if it's run by a what they consider to be an Iranian-backed Shia government or an anti-Kurdish Arab government. So we need to make sure that the Shia do not economically divorce the rest of Iraq. That's, for me, one of the hidden truths of what's going on at the moment, which is that Sunni secessionism, despite everything that's happened with ISIS, is not going to break up Iraq. Kurdish quest for autonomy probably also will not break up Iraq. There are many regional forces trying to keep Kurds in, including Turkey, in the way it's not releasing Kurdish oil funds to Turkey. If anyone can break up Iraq, if anyone is going to choose to break up Iraq, it will be the Shia. And they can do it in a heartbeat. And if they mishandle the current revenue sharing discussions with the Kurds, if they mishandle or choose to take a hard line on things like decentralisation of security decision making with the Sunnis, if they fail to resource the Sunni provinces as they liberate them, then they will break Iraq permanently, probably.
Well, on that rosy note, off to Phillip to help explain the Shia militant groups and what role they're playing alongside within the Iraqi forces.
Thanks, Matt. Unfortunately, I will just say this now. I don't think there's any putting the genie back in the bottle when it comes to Iraq, especially with dealing with the Shia militias. There are now around 50 active militias. The majority of them are controlled by Iran that are now operating in Iraq and in Syria. But how did we really get here? These are not really a new thing. Many of the groups, many of these front organizations may appear new. But if we're really looking back at it, a lot of this starts with the Badr organization. Badr organization was started with the assistance of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, formed out of Iraqis who were generally along with the Khomeinist line that was all the rage in many Shia areas in the late 1970s, early 80s. And from there, many of these groups have grown. So after we invaded Iraq, many of these organizations kind of flowed right back in, found positions within government, and are now acting, well, in concert with the government. When we're kind of looking at Syria and we're looking at Iraq, these militias have played a hugely important role militarily on the ground. I would argue that Bashar al-Assad had no way to really turn back rebel forces with his own native forces if these foreign Shia militants were not brought in by the Iranians. And this is also a process that's been going on since 2012. It was very, very well hidden by them. So initially what would actually occur is they put in Lebanese Hezbollah people, Asai Bahl al-Haq, Kataib Hezbollah people, and they were all around ostensibly defending the Sayyidah Zainab shrine. So they actually put up a very nice romantic image that they were doing shrine defense in Syria, but meanwhile, many of these groups were acting all over the country. Initially, it was primarily Lebanese and Iraqi fighters, Iraqi Shia. There was a huge recruitment program that was going on throughout 2013, starting in May, for Iraqi Shia. This has actually continued to this day, where one of the organizations, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, is still recruiting people to be sent to Syria. I think when we're kind of looking at this, there are a few issues. Dr. Knight's actually noticed an issue with sectarianism, and I think these Shia groups have actually been helping drive this quite a bit. We'll hear lines out of the Iranians where they will say, we're non-sectarian, and in fact, they'll kind of repeat the Khomeinist line where they will say, this sectarianism in the region is nothing but a Western plot. They have been pushing it actively within Iraq and within Syria. In Iraq, initially, when these groups, these Shia militia groups that are under their control were there, in the mid-2000s, they were ethnically cleansing Sunnis out of Baghdad. These were the guys who were putting electric drills through captured Sunnis' heads. This was all going on, and it didn't really get much coverage. Well, why didn't it get much coverage? Many of these groups are actually embedded directly with the Iraqi security forces. The Badr organization actually dominates the so-called emergency response units, the SWAT teams, a lot of these other ISF units, and one of their people actually dominated the Ministry of Interior, and oddly enough, another one is back there today. So they had a good level of control in there. What's really interesting is some of these same militants, these Iraqi Shia militants who were sent to Syria, also had experience in the Iraqi army. One of the members of Asay Bahl al-Haq, which we may remember as a special group which was blowing up EFPs, explosively formed penetrator IEDs, next to American Humvees and M2 Bradleys. This guy actually served in the Muthanna Brigade in the Iraqi army. He actually wore his Iraqi army patches when he was on the ground in Syria fighting. So I really think that the integration and kind of takeover has essentially fully happened. So when we look at Syria, and I'm sorry that I'm going back and forth, but this is a joined front. When we look at Syria and the real effect that the Shia militias have had, it's been multifold. For starters, we have kind of the direct military presence, which is on the ground. These forces have been able to push back rebel forces in all sorts of different locations. We saw the Battle of Qusair. This is the first battle that was announced, and this is also when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, when he announced that Hezbollah forces were officially in Syria. That battle occurred. In Aleppo, they have been a key contingent in pushing back rebel forces and also in securing certain Shia villages. Within those Shia villages, these same Iraqi, Lebanese Shia militias have also been creating brand new Hezbollahs. There were reports that were coming out that the NDF, the National Defense Forces, which was modeled on Iran's Basij, that this is essentially the process that was going on, and that was really the Hezbollahization of the Syrian military and Syrian militants. But it goes much further than that. There is actually a number of different sub-Hezbollahs, Syrian Hezbollahs. They call them Al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya fi Suriya, the Islamic resistance in Syria. A number of these have been established throughout the country, and they're extremely active. And by the way, when they bury a so-called martyr, it has a Hezbollah flag on it, it has a Syrian flag on it, there's a picture of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and then there's a picture of Bashar al-Assad. So we're now seeing the full Hezbollahization, if you will, of the conflict in Syria. These guys are not buried. Some of these new Shia militias in Syria, they're located in places like Basra al-Sham, which is in southern Syria, or they're in Nabl and Zahra, nowhere near Sayyidah Zainab, which is in southern Syria, yet they're buried as defenders of Sayyidah Zainab. So even the narrative has caught that these are the shrine defenders, that they are defending Shiism, that there is, in the words of one Shia Jihadi song, it's Ashat al-Muqawama, there's this united resistance that is being built. So that's actually what's occurred in Syria, and it's only getting worse. Now Iraq is, I would want to say that it's a totally different story. Unfortunately, it's not. They used the same narrative techniques when a lot of these forces were actually shipped back from Syria to Iraq to counter ISIS and other Sunni groups. And this actually happened very, very early on. A lot of people really didn't take notice of it, but it was mentioned in some Arabic press articles. Starting around December of 2013, this is also during the height of many of the offensive actions within Syria, many of these Shia militants were actually flown back. Key commanders, key fighters, well-known people. And they would even post pictures online of them descending the steps from an airplane in Baghdad airport and then picking up their Kalashnikov and going straight to the front. So there was a redeployment in that way. And with said redeployment, there was also this growth of a multitude of different militia organizations. They didn't always keep the name that they had when they were located in Syria. They just changed names, put a new patch on their shoulders, and went off to the battlefield. But what really happened starting at that point was they were attached to the Iraqi army. When they were attached to the Iraqi army, this did not make everyone in the Iraqi army happy. They were not happy with Asayb al-Haq people giving them orders and saying, we have more experience fighting the so-called takfiris than you people do. So, sorry, you better listen to us. And if you don't, then there's going to be problems back in Baghdad. So this occurred. But then it only got worse from there. There was actually a covert, and then it turned into an overt recruiting program. This was in the spring, before the main offensives in June in Iraq by ISIS, where these kind of IRGC-QF, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force controlled groups were doing active recruitment. And you would actually, I mean, if you called into any of their phone banks, one time I called in, and I speak pretty bad Lebanese Arabic, where they told me, we don't need any Lebanese here. We just want Iraqi brothers to defend the homeland and to defend the sacred shrines. Just stay in Lebanon and pray. So this was beginning very, very early on. Kataib Hezbollah, which is a registered terrorist group by the State Department, they actually began this process along with the Badr organization. Badr organization, Dr. Knights mentioned before, with extensive links in the Iraqi government. So they already saw the writing on the wall before it was ever publicly announced. I mean, a lot of people were focusing on Sistani's announcement for jihad, which, by the way, these Iranian proxy groups took full advantage of. They said, look, Sistani's on our side now, even though he was not. He was saying you need to join the Iraqi army, not these proxy militia forces. So there's been a lot of problems going on. It's not just the Iranian proxy groups which are extremely active in Iraq. We also have Muqtada al-Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr has restarted, in many ways, his Jaysh al-Mahdi, but under a more kind of firm control, where he, as a leader, doesn't necessarily issue the commands for the group, as he's claimed, but he instead has a group of about 3 to 5 who command this organization. It numbers in the tens of thousands. And these guys were highly sectarian actors during the war. Many of them got infiltrated by the Iranians, so it caused even further problems. And mind you, Muqtada al-Sadr is not a huge fan of the Iranians, despite fighting alongside them and also taking their arms and taking their money. Excuse me. But that's another process that's been going on. So we're seeing a general radicalization of the Shia populace because of this huge existential threat that's come from ISIS, and also this manufactured threat that has come from Iran, which claims to say that the Shia around the world are being oppressed by an evil Western conspiracy with the aid of the Israelis, and that this is now coming to the forefront in Iraq, and if you don't defend it there, then we're kaput. Kind of on another note, just focusing on the Iraq and the Syrian fronts, it's more than just Iraqi or Lebanese or Syrian Shia fighters. This has now become, I would even say, a kind of a pan-Islamic type of recruitment technique for Iran. Iran announced that one of their martyrs at Sayyida Zainab was a man by the last name of Kouni. That's the only part of his name I could actually confirm. And he was supposedly from Côte d'Ivoire. So there's a growing Shia community there, which is for the most part dominated by Lebanese Hezbollah, and now they're recruiting fighters there. There have been reports of Somali Mujahideen, which were fighting alongside Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas, which was the first named Shia militia that was in Damascus. And I've seen the videos of these guys, and they're often shown in leadership positions. So now they're passing this experience on to other radical groups. Beyond that, you then have the Hazara Afghans. Hazara Afghan Shia, which are also actively being recruited in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and also possibly in the West. So this is kind of a huge effort. Recently, I actually found this, one of the groups, I won't name it, but it's a front group for Asayb al-Haq, was trying to recruit Pakistani Shia to come and fight in Iraq. And if we remember a few weeks ago, this is an announcement which, it was kind of on the down low if you were following the news. There was also a Pakistani martyr from Samarra. He was fighting in Samarra, and they buried him in Qom, the holy city in Iran. So When we're kind of looking at this full thrust, it's Iran trying to dominate the Shia, trying to push their own discourse, their own narratives, their own fighting groups, and dominate across the field. We're talking Iraqi government, Syrian government, the military forces, and frankly, I only see this getting much, much worse.
Please do join me in thanking my colleagues here. This has been a wonderful panel. I want to thank you all for taking the time, and we'll be happy to answer any questions we didn't get to now afterwards during the break, or at least I hope you will be. Thank you all very much.